and then pass on the microphone to Hans de Wit. I would like to welcome all to this webinar today on November 12, 2020. And we're on for a very strong conversation on the future of international collaboration and academic partnerships. I'm very pleased as Secretary General of the International Association of Universities to warmly welcome you to this series of IAU webinars on the future of higher education, looking at short, medium, and long-term developments. We already have discussed quite a few topics since the higher education webinar series started, and we've discussed internationalization dynamics and transformation, the impact of COVID-19 on higher education, which obviously is still on the backdrop of any of our conversations today, the future of academic freedom, strategy development at higher education, reopening strategies or examination. In the future, we will also address again what we did in the past, but these are sequential. We will discuss again digitalization of higher education and issues of access. What does it mean? We will develop new discussions around the very notion of leadership transformation today. But I'm very pleased to pass on the baton to Hans de Wit because we are co-organizing this webinar and always very pleased to do so. And Hans, to introduce you to the dynamics of this very discussion on the future of international collaboration. So Hans, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hilke, and hello everybody. Welcome to this joint webinar with the International Association of Universities. As director of the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College, we have a close collaboration with IAU on organizing these webinars on topics of the future of international higher education and internationalization of higher education. And this topic, what we are going to address today, is a very crucial one. We have seen that during the pandemic and also all the other important geopolitical tensions that have been part of our life in the past year, in particular, for instance, between Australia and the US on one hand and China on the other hand, that the whole debate about international collaboration and partnerships in the academic context becomes much more sensitive. We see also that the more physical partnerships have become to a stop, and we had to address our relationships in the academic atmosphere to new, much more online collaboration and actions. And to some extent, we have been pretty successful, as this webinar shows, but at the same time gives all kinds of challenges. One of the challenges, for instance, is that given all the different time zones, I mixed up this webinar with another webinar I have to present in half an hour on refugees in higher education with the Global Center for Higher Education Studies. So I will have to leave briefly after this introduction, but it is an expression of how we struggle on the one hand with international collaboration in the digital world, but at the same time we see that there's so much happening in that digital world these days on communication, discussion, debate, and action in international collaboration. So the topic of today is very important, and we do that from a context which looks a little bit more promising for the future than it was, let's say, 2 weeks ago. On the one hand, because of the results of the elections in the United States, although someone still doesn't want to believe that there's going to be a change in administration, but that will probably have a positive impact on international higher education and partnerships, but also the positive news about the vaccine, which might also open up to much more interaction and collaboration. Will that mean that we will not have webinars anymore, but will be traveling around the world again? I doubt so. We will see, hopefully, a nice mix of online and on-site communication taking place in the future. And also in the collaboration atmosphere, we will try to find a much more balanced way of how to deal with that. And contexts are very important. So we have perspectives from the South African context with Orla. We have a perspective from India, from Kalyani, and we have a perspective from the United States with Sutton. in this webinar with all kind of interesting perspectives to the topic, but also with space for you to ask questions to the presenters and to put comments in the chat box. And Hilge and Giorgio from IU will moderate that discussion very carefully with you in the 1.5 hours that are available during this webinar. So thank you all for taking part in this important webinar, and thank you to our presenters to be willing to communicate through this platform. And we have had some challenges to do that, which is also part of our learning experience, how to collaborate online. But I wish you all a very good next period of discussions and presentations. Thank you very much, and have a good webinar. We start now. Hilge, can you introduce Orla, or will Giorgio do that? Or?
Yes, with great pleasure. So thank you very much for this very opening. Hans, always a great pleasure for the both organizations, Boston College and the Center for International Higher Education and the IAU, to work together so that we can indeed foster the kind of dialogues that we need. But we're very pleased to do that also with the many representatives attending the webinar. Echo. Maybe, yes, is this better like this? So we're expecting people to join us from more than 50 countries from around the world. And that in itself is already fascinating and shows to what extent the discussion that we're having here today is important. Orla, Quinlan and the IAU, and even Orla, Quinlan and Boston College, I would say we go a long way, and we're very pleased and honored to have you with us here today. You are speaking out of South Africa. You say you're in confinement with an empty university behind you, but we're very pleased that you could still join us, take part in this conversation, and explain to us what the current situation, with the difficulties, the challenges, yet also the opportunities, are bringing to the very topic of international collaboration and academic partnerships. So please, Orla, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I'm afraid I couldn't hear the last speaker at all, so I don't know what's happening. So I'm greeting you here from Rhodes University in Eastern Cape in South Africa. And I just want to make some opening remarks about how the whole situation has affected us here, some of the challenges around academic partnerships. And I'm also currently the president of IESA, so I want to talk a little bit about how we have adapted during this period as well. So, of course, the biggest challenge during the period has been the impact of the reduction of physical mobility while operating under lockdown initially and under restricted conditions afterwards. And we're now in a situation where each region, each day, there's a certain level of ebb and flow in terms of how we manage the COVID situation. So I'm living in a province where cases are increasing at the moment. And obviously I'm in a university with many buildings. So we are taking precautions. If, for example, there is a case in a particular building, in that building, it doesn't mean the whole university closes, but we're just learning to live differently with this virus. And to take precautions to keep as many people as possible safe, while simultaneously trying to continue and do our work and do our business as usual. Well, as unusual, perhaps. So from an African perspective, the move to online interaction has really, I think, opened our minds to the possibilities of increased engagement and collaboration. If I take the example of IESA, the organization that represents the public institutions of South Africa, we generally hold a face-to-face annual conference, and then we hold face-to-face workshops, and we hold face-to-face meetings, and we travel around the country. This year, we set up a series of very relevant webinars about the impact of the current situation on internationalization and on students. dealing with the practical issues we were facing and the impact of COVID-19 on our students and partnership activities. And we delivered that series free to our members as a service. We also set up several WhatsApp groups to have ongoing daily communication. So we've actually shifted from less frequent, more formal ways of face-to-face working to far more frequent informal ways of working, using technology and online engagement, which is resulting in more capacity building and sharing of knowledge in the sector, and in terms of, sharing experiences of how we're addressing the challenges. If I then look at the intra-regional collaboration between two international education associations in Africa, and I'm going to refer to ANI, which is the African Network of Internationalization in Higher Education, and IESA, which is a South African-based organization, or focused organization. Our relationship has actually flourished under these conditions. I think previously we had a bit of a prevalent mindset that lack of access to funding prevented us doing intra-regional collaboration in Africa, because the thinking was we needed to get together, we needed to get to know each other, we needed to be in a physical face-to-face environment to actually work together. And some of the things that really hindered this was, of course, the physical costs of traveling to countries and the challenges involved in getting visas. So both in terms of time and money, we kind of had this sense of, it's difficult to do. It's more difficult to move around Africa between African countries. It's more expensive. You mightn't get direct flights than it is, for example, in Europe, where you can, literally hop on a train and go to each other's countries. So that was kind of a psychological hurdle in many ways. And so the move to online engagement has just shifted our way of communicating and collaborating, and the pace at which we expect to go from a suggestion or an idea to implementing it. So, for example, we signed an MOU in August, and since then, so it's now the coming, mid-November, we've actually held a webinar jointly. We've done a joint virtual conference for 2 days, which attracted interest from across the world. And we've done lots of kind of interviews and, given comments since that. So the obstacles of the physically bordered world and gated access world have actually disappeared to some extent, because with this adaptation to the virtual world, we can engage again in more frequent informal conversations and more joint activities. To coin a phrase used by Laura Rumley of EAIE when she was talking to us about how we're working together, she coined the phrase that it's a pragmatic dynamism in our way of working. But certainly, if we had thought of doing a face-to-face conference together, we would have been talking about it now and not doing it until 2021. Instead, we talked about it in August and we did it in October. So that's one of the interesting advantages, I think, spin-offs of the current situation. Of course, at university level, there are many and equal challenges to existing intra-regional and inter-regional partnerships. I don't necessarily see a distinction between how we're engaging, for example, with the rest of Africa and how we're engaging with the rest of the world. I think the obstacles and the opportunities are more or less equal for us, beyond that psychological thing where I think we just, we've all moved to thinking we can do more actually without physically traveling, which maybe was the issue before. There might have been more funding opportunities to engage in North America or to engage in Europe, and perhaps less funding opportunities to move around Africa. But this moving to online has it's been a great equalizer in some ways, because it's created equal challenges and equal opportunities across the board. So in terms of the international partnerships at university level, I would say that, again, equally impacted in terms of relationships in the region or across the rest of the world. We've had to change the planned timeframes of when things would be happening. The content of collaborations has been affected, and the method of interacting has also been affected. Obviously, international mobility has been halted or hampered. And to be honest, even though the borders are open again, I'm seeing quite a lot of reluctance to move unless you really have to because people are concerned that with the ebb and flow of COVID, you might get stuck somewhere, and that has financial implications. It's difficult to the unpredictability of the situation is difficult for people to feel confident about doing things that maybe we did before. I think, again, in terms of research setbacks, the kind of lack of face-to-face interactions for research focus groups, they have been suspended and halted. In labs during lockdown, people literally, they got setbacks by several months because their experiments couldn't be monitored, they couldn't get access, they were destroyed. So those types of situations arose, and people are trying to rethink, how do we do it differently? Because even if you set everything up again the way it was, there's nothing to say that any of us won't be back into a lockdown at some point. You can see in Europe, there's this second wave happening. I think it's fair to assume this virus will be around, and that there may be other viruses, coming our way, that this is going to have to be something we learn to prepare for and we learn to manage. With regards to partnerships that involve teaching and learning, I've literally just come from another event where one of the universities in South Africa here were just launching a COIL initiative, the Collaborative Online International Learning. Here in South Africa, any kind of international teaching and learning programs, I think you've got, again, the distinction between universities that are well-resourced and universities that are less well-resourced. Obviously, some universities had the infrastructure in place to move to online teaching and learning with a certain level of quality about how that was happening. In most instances, we had universities really went into an emergency mode of teaching and learning. And literally, but what I mean by that is lecturers literally had their lecture notes and were doing lectures online, as opposed to having a more creative, engaged, deliberate and purposeful online teaching and learning. And again, you will see the distinction and the inequalities between the better off universities that have the resources to back up that type of system versus those that don't. And so, you will see some inequality in the quality of delivery of teaching and learning have occurred as well. I think one of the things that has been exacerbated, but from our side, from the South African side, it doesn't matter who we're engaging with, is the fact of having to move off the campus and work from home. People have very varied home conditions. So you've got a situation where you might be at home with several other people using whatever broadband you have, and it's competitive, and you might have overcrowded conditions. So, for example, with students and, with sort of more junior staff members, there was the issue of having access to laptops. And even if you got a laptop, there was an issue of having access to electricity. We're in a country where electricity sometimes gets shut down for load shedding. Then there's the issue about, do you have enough data? Do you even have internet coverage in certain parts of Africa? If you go far enough into rural areas, there's not great internet coverage. So these are challenges that were occurring, I think, from this side, regardless of where the partnerships were with, whether they were intra-regionally or with other people across the globe. So I think that, that's kind of a lot of the challenges. And then just on the positive side, there's no question people have been forced to open up their thinking, to think more creatively, to imagine new ways of doing things and to work differently. IESA, we did a conference last year and the debate was, is the fourth industrial revolution going to be impactful on us and will we be engaging? And I mean, that question has been answered. Everyone has had to engage with technology. Even some of the professors that really don't like having to do it have to. So I think that the other thing is in research, it's involved more sharing, reduced isolated working in silos. People are talking to each other because they want to know, how are you resolving your problem about how you do things, because we need to do things differently as well. So from that perspective, I think people are sharing ideas, they're being brought together. And I do think there's a whole new range of questions for the humanities. I think the content of research, the nature of research is going to have to think differently and think more closely to the global societal problems. I think this may have been the end of the university working in isolation. I think people are going to have to work sort of in universities, cognizant of their integral part with the society around them locally and globally. And I just would give,
Orla?
Yeah.
Yes, we will keep a little bit for the discussion afterwards as well.
Okay, let me end it there. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Orla. And this is to give everybody 10 minutes to give some appetizers for the debate afterwards as well, and go around the world. So I would love to now give the floor to Kalyani Unkule. I hope I pronounce your name properly. I'm very pleased to see you come from India, from OP Jindal Global University. Your tagline is a private university promoting public service, which is a beautiful tagline. And we know your university well now for a long time, and it's very good to see you take part in this conversation, also from the perspective not of an organization, but of an institution specifically. So I give you the floor to also highlight how you see the new challenges or the new opportunities to international cooperation at the academic level.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I apologize in advance for the background noise because we are in the middle of both the Diwali festival and wedding season in Delhi. And this year, having been what it is, I think people are just taking a moment to do what they can to cheer themselves up. So you can't take that away from them, I guess. Yeah, so we've been asked to reflect on how international collaboration and academic partnerships have changed in the context of disruption due to COVID-19 and how it might evolve in the future. So I will make some quick points on this, both from an Asian/Global South perspective and also trying to think globally. Firstly, I think it is important to remember that technology informs and shapes the ambit of our possibilities, but it alone should not dictate our strategy or where we invest our time and effort. This sounds pretty obvious, but I think this is a mistake that we make when we go a little bit overboard, just because it's easier now to get online, and we start reimagining our possibilities purely around what technology allows us to do. We have all coped, I think, quite well with the abrupt disruptions to physical mobility as internationalization practitioners by stepping up the usage of online tools. However, unless there is greater investment in curriculum internationalization and decolonization across the board, it is my sense that technology will only reinforce the disparities in knowledge creation and dissemination prevailing in higher education, and also thereby preventing the higher education internationalization project from attaining its true potential. So while it's great to have so many possibilities thanks to technology, I think equally we should not forget what the original issues with the whole internationalization project were. Secondly, we need, I think, a rethink and a sound assessment of the extent to which resources are freed up thanks to a greater emphasis on initiatives in the remote and blended mode. There is already, this is already obvious from all the conference budgets saved this year as a result of going virtual. However, we need to go beyond that and explore how international partnerships and networks can prevent duplication of effort and deliver a multiplier effect when there is programmatic innovation in what we are doing, rather than a rush to embrace some stagnant notion of best practice, right? Like it's no secret that in my writing and in my work, I've encouraged people to move away from this idea of best practice, or using the word best practice, which I find to be incredibly arrogant way of putting things. So when we're thinking of the way resources are freed up because of going online or going blended, I think we need a sound assessment of how international partnerships and networks can prevent duplication of effort. And often when we kind of present something as best practice, there's a rush where everybody wants to copy that model, right? Instead, what we need to think about is, okay, what is the reason behind being part of a network? It's so that others can do what they're good at and we can do what we're good at, and we can all pool our efforts. I think that when we talk about best practice, it kind of takes us away from this idea of like pooling of efforts and working off of each other's complementarities. So an example of this could be remote foreign language instruction, which has typically not received serious attention as a program component, but has the potential to reach far beyond those students and staff who have the ability to travel. Such an approach also addresses intra-institutional inclusion, which has been both a long-standing ambition and thus far a low priority of internationalization. So although internationalization practitioners have been saying for the longest time that we want to expand the number of students within our institution and the number of faculty members and the number of staff and stakeholders within our institutions who benefit from internationalization initiatives, we have not exactly been able to achieve that to the extent that we should have. And I think this is one aspect that we can work on now. A resource-centric perspective is key to imagining the future of internationalization in Asia in particular, where the allocation of staff and budget for internationalization has generally been much lower than in other regions. So in Asia, it particularly makes sense to think of this resource-centric force multiplier, prevention of duplication kind of approach through partner networks. And now the universities, in fact, everywhere are facing the resource crunch. Such thinking is really the need of the hour. I come now to my final point, which is that the most important questions then going forward will be, A, do international partnerships in higher education help address the environmental crisis, which is, of course, especially acute and worrisome in high density, in high population density Asia, and the demographic trends which necessitate lifelong learning. So will internationalization be the thing that allows higher education in general to address these two very important issues, which is the climate crisis and our demographics? B, will we decolonize our minds just enough to delve into the wealth of our indigenous knowledge systems and find ways to live harmoniously with nature? And which, of course, means encouraging other ways of knowing in the way we do research, in what we consider to be science, in the way we teach, in the way we learn. And C, will we redefine the purpose of education so that generations to come are actually equipped for a radically altered relationship to work and a sense of self and one's purpose in a fundamentally altered paradigm that broke free from the crystal ball and visited us in 2020. So will we be able, through education, to really bring that mindset change which is now needed? Because as we saw in 2020, our relationship to work, the place that work has in our life, just suddenly changed, So it's no longer about reskilling and upskilling and all these easy solutions. It's no longer about preparing yourself for career changes throughout the course of your life. But I think it's something that we didn't see coming, which is that our relationship to work itself, the place the role that work has in our life, the place that it has in our life, and what it means for our sense of self itself has received this kind of shock this year. And I think we need to prepare ourselves for that as educators, and we need to think about this in the months and years to come. So with that, I hand over back to Hilkia.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And this is, again, a very different perspective on the very big topic that we're addressing here. And I'm pleased to now turn to Susan Sutton to also address the issues that that we have already on the table, but you probably will shed a different light there again to these very big topics. You come from also an organization working with higher education leaders from around the country, but also globally. And so you may explain just a little bit of the background also that you will use and against which you will share your ideas on the development on international and academic relations, because that will also be complementary to the previous 2 points of view and will allow to go into a further discussion next. The word is yours, Susan, for 10 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. I provided 2 PowerPoint slides. If they can't be shown, it's all right. I don't absolutely need them. But let me begin by saying how much I've learned already from hearing the previous 2 speakers. Also, I think you're going to see actually a lot of resonance among the various messages that we have. As for my particular background in talking to you today, I am in the United States. I am representing here today the American Council on Education, for which I am a senior advisor, having retired after 40 years as an anthropology professor and international administrator at 2 US institutions, Indiana University and Bryn Mawr College. But I also will be bringing the perspectives I have from not only from ACE, the American Council on Education, but from IIE, the Institute of International Education, where I am a fellow now. This is what retirement can allow one to do. And also Association of International Education Administrators, of which I am past president. All of us, all of these organizations, and also NAFSA here in the United States, have been holding multiple virtual conversations, both formal and informal, to pick up that point, on all of these topics. That gives me some confidence in speaking for my colleagues here in the United States on what is the impact of the current, I will say, the crises of 2020 on international partnerships for US institutions. I say crises because COVID is one, and it's a very dramatic one, but we are having a moment of racial justice reckoning in the United States that is very important and very pervasive in its impact on academic institutions right now as well, etc. So there are multiple crises going on at once. Now, as we've already heard, these crises that we're facing have presented incredible challenges to all of us: mobility restrictions, stranded students, health and safety issues, fraught international relationships between nations. And being a citizen of the United States, I can speak quite directly to our fraught international relationships. Thank you for this. And waves of, I'll say it, xenophobia, fear of the outsider, arising in the midst of all of this as a reaction that can have a very negative impact upon universities in general, international programs and universities in specific. Budget cuts, they are occurring in the United States. It may surprise you to know that even our public universities rarely get more than 25% of their funding from the state. So there are tremendous budget cuts that are causing institutions to rethink their priorities. And that means what's going to happen to internationalization as a priority when it's put against other priorities at this moment, etc. These are very significant challenges. But as it says on the second line here, at an IIE, the Institute of International Education webinar in May of this year, there were 400 institutions attending, not all from the United States, some were from other countries as well, but most from the US. When we posed the question to the attendees of the webinar about their international partnerships, and I use on the slides, IP means international partnership, 57, that is over half of the institutions, said that their international partnerships had actually become more active this year. Part of this gets to something that we heard earlier about the volume of informal communication going on virtually has actually heightened, and it's in some ways it caused greater interaction than the periodic face-to-face meetings that would happen during normal partnership relations. But this constant back and forth has really activated things. But in addition, I think we've all found, at least from the US perspective, we've found that our international partners have been a source of great support and comfort in this situation. And for well-developed partnerships, and this is a really critical point, for well-developed partnerships, I'll return to what well-developed means in a few minutes, but for well-developed partnerships, they not only have withstood the challenges of the present moment, they have met these challenges in some really remarkable ways, responding to partnership needs very creatively. The US has lots of students overseas. We have lots of international students in the US. So, for example, lots of students were stranded as the various travel restrictions were put in place around the world. And as partners, if we had well-developed partnerships, we were able to support the stranded students, find them housing. If they were having to adapt to learning virtually, but had very little experience with that, working with them to do that. As we heard earlier, lots of use of COIL, collaborative online international learning, to continue working with partners, including, I find this very interesting, such things as having virtual internships in each other's countries. Fascinating, where you have, for example, US students working with students from other countries, doing an internship in their local community and vice versa, but beaming this work into each other so that, and these internships would be on similar topics. We also have, for example, another creative says they're medical supplies, just by way of another example. Very interesting that as COVID hit the United States rather dramatically, we found many of our Chinese partners were sending us packages of personal protective equipment, just spontaneously. No requests were made, but our medical faculty were receiving these packages of equipment that they could use as they were treating patients. Yes, keep it there. And then, as our situation tamped down, our faculty were sending packages to our Chinese partners. So I could go on and on. Well, here's one other example that the many US institutions have maintained their enrollment of international students this year in fall 2020, this academic year in fall 2020, by having the students meet at partner institutions in the students' home countries, but being taught virtually using COIL by the faculty from the US institutions. So there's been a lot of this kind of very creative activity that has intensified the partnerships. Now, getting to another point that both the previous speakers have referred to, this going virtual, which I fully agree, Kalyani, should not be the driver. It should be the mechanism, but not the driver. I couldn't agree more. This going virtual has flattened some resource differentials. Orla, I heard you loud and clear about that all depends on how connected you are, et cetera. Although John Rubin, who is the inventor of COIL at the SUNY system, says even a smartphone can do it if you need to. But in any event, going virtual has flattened resource differentials. And what Cheryl Matherly at Lehigh University has called the democratization of many of our partnerships. By this, she means, and I fully agree with her, that the differences between well-resourced and less well-resourced universities are fading in this virtual atmosphere. And it's allowing greater interaction with our partners in parts of the world that have had less interaction in the past. greater interaction. It's giving them greater prominence in our overall partnership portfolios, partners in countries outside of the usual suspects, let us say. And so this is a real recognition that we could be doing more with partners in parts of the world where we haven't been doing that much. And it's causing us to take a look at our partnership portfolios and say, why are they lumped up in Western Europe and in East Asia? Why aren't we looking more broadly? Because we can do these things now. The second slide, there are only 2 slides here. I'll go on to the content. There we go. So as both Orla and Kalyani have said, all of this activity and this creativity and this sort of moment to think has opened up space to rethink our international partnership goals and practices. This is a watershed moment that partnerships will not be the same when we come back from this, which we will. I can assure you, having just been through a very important election, we'll come back from all of this. So it will happen. So here's some thoughts as I think about it, where we should be putting our attention in the future with respect to international partnerships, particularly of academic institutions. We should pay more attention to relationship building. Most US institutions have far too many partnerships that are on paper only. We've been trying to cull our partnership portfolios and pay more attention to having really meaningful ones rather than just paper ones. And this means, in some ways, moving from what you might call transactional partnerships, where you're just exchanging students, or you give me this, we'll give you something equivalent in return, to what I like to think of as generative partnerships, where we're collaborating together to create something that neither of us could have. And this gets to the resource sharing, I think, Kalyani, that you were talking about as well. The second box here, we also need, of course, as everyone has been saying, to move beyond physical mobility and designing partnerships. This will achieve a great many purposes. Physical mobility is still important. I'm a cultural anthropologist. I do believe in face-to-face interactions, but I also believe we can have those interactions virtually now if we construct the virtual environment in a certain way. But we have to be very intentional in doing that. And I also believe that going beyond physical mobility opens up the possibility for dialogue and collaboration for more of our students than could ever travel normally. The United States really only sends about 10% of its students abroad in any given year. 90% will never go, but we could do a lot more, and vice versa for a lot more in terms of global learning and creating opportunities for direct interaction and dialogue for our students with your students. If we think about the ways in which we can design partnerships to still have some aspects of physical mobility, but to take advantage of this tool of IT that we have in front of us. Now, the third box, really important when there's rising xenophobia, racism, fraught international relations, etc., and budget crunches and reprioritization at our institutions. We must articulate the value of international partnerships beyond the international office. And we have to become proficient in articulating it in ways that will resonate with students, with faculty, with higher education, our higher education institution leadership, with our surrounding communities and with our nations. We have to help them understand why the partnerships are important. And just a few words on that, although we may want to pick this up in the open discussion.
We can do that as well, yeah. But these points are very important. So very quickly, because you have a little less than a minute.
Oh, okay. Well, then I'll skip, except that I will add that in my 4 to 5 decades in higher education, I've come to understand that international academic partnerships operate on a different plane from other international relationships. And we, as in higher education, we really have a role to play in guiding the world in a collaborative, non-divisive way by working on these more intensely. Then the final box here is examining international partnerships with what in the United States is called a DEI lens, diversity, equity, inclusion, in this moment of racial justice reckoning again, and Black Lives Matter, etc., which is very critical to us. But we have to look at our partnerships practices once again and continuing to enhance our practices of mutual benefit and decision-making that we've been working on so it's not so one-sided or parasitic or colonial, but also to articulating the assets that all partners bring, to identifying who is included and who is excluded and opening our partnerships to a wider range of our students, a wider range of our academic fields, other countries than we normally do, and institutional types. And I will end by saying we need to move beyond ranking and that kind of criteria in choosing partners very clearly. We need to democratize this. Okay, I think I got it in 1 minute. I'm done.
Well, thank you very much to the three speakers for this excellent start of a conversation, and the participants can see already that 10 minutes each is certainly not enough because we see how much more you could contribute to the debate, and we will get an opportunity to unleash some of that in the discussion period as well. So if the participants would take the time to also formulate some questions in the chat box, that would be more than welcome. If I pick up something from all three presentations, and a first question I would like to ask to all, you all seem to say, well, there is an opportunity to change and to transform and to develop a different kind of partnership strategy around the world. That is something that this current period and pandemic has offered as an opportunity. But do you see this as something that is there to stay, or is it just occasional? And to what extent would you be able to measure that this is really true and something that is developing in a way that will allow to confirm a new kind of partnership? I liked, and maybe I will pick up from your last point, Susan. We need to go beyond rankings and pick up new kinds of partnerships. That's fuel to my own discourse each and every time, where I think that rankings are only shrinking the perspectives and putting the spotlight on far too few universities that then all want to work together and not the others. But that's something else. And the DEI lens, very important. And then Kalyani, the point that you made on the very need to decolonize our minds, and that could be part and parcel of the same kind of coin somehow. And we need to look at how the altered relations to everything that we used to do is also entering into this partnership building. How do we work differently together? And then the point that was made by Orla before, that yes, there are many opportunities out there, and that there is also a recentering of the kind of partnership opportunities, where there were challenges, for instance, intra-regional in Africa, where traveling from South Africa to Kenya was much more complex than traveling from South Africa to the UK or to the US. And today, will that indeed be an opportunity to segue into different kinds of partnerships and then confirm that for the future? So the transformative dynamics around international collaboration and academic partnerships, is this now, here and now, or is it something that will probably also be continued in the future? So shall I start with Kalyani? You're on the screen. I don't see Orla entering.
Yeah, sure. I think some things are easier to change than others. The thing that's hardest to change is some mindsets around, what is the legitimate way of creating knowledge? What is the best way to teach and learn? What is considered science and what isn't? what is prestigious, and this is where I love the point that you made, Susan, about rankings, right? So I think these are changes that are going to take some time, and because because we have to start somewhere. I think we could start by acknowledging that learning is equally available everywhere, right? So if we start from that premise, then I think we can truly achieve this ideal of democratization through internationalization, which we're trying to work towards. And here is where, like, even though technology has flattened some of these disparities, it really still also sometimes exposes some of the underlying problems. Like very early on, sometime in May, I was part of a webinar where we were exchanging experiences on transitioning assessments online, right? And a couple of the participants from different parts of the world, from universities in Africa and Asia, in Latin America, they were asking, well, what if we don't have that teaching model which can be transitioned online, right? Where you do the flipped classroom and you assign group activities and you do all of those things which are possible online. What if we just don't have that model in place yet, right? So we do have to. I think a lot of the discussion needs to happen also in the domain of knowledge creation and teaching and learning. And internationalization practitioners need to have these conversations with people who are working on this side of things as well. And that, I think, will make for a really kind of fruitful, a promising, help us chart a more promising course forward.
I will give you the floor, Susan, and then I hope. Okay, you have to be let in, Orla. We will let you in. But Susan, can you pick up on that? And then Orla, you will be let in next.
Yes. Well, I agree with everything that Kalyani just said. And as to the, let me then expand on it a little bit in response to your overall question. Is this just a momentary thing, a blip on the trajectory of history, or is this something that's going to be long lasting? And here's my response to that. I think this is going to have long lasting impact. And I think it for two reasons. One, if we look at the whole history of academic internationalization, if you go back to the 1980s, when this was really starting to take off in various parts of the world, where universities were lifting up their heads and thinking a little bit more broadly, we'll see that there was a phase of sort of trying to spread it within your own institution, that make it a priority for your own institution. But then for the last 15 years, we had spread it into our own institutions, and indeed many of us found that our presidents and chancellors and rectors were spouting our own rhetoric back to us without really understanding it, but they were still doing that. And we then entered a phase of what I would call, and we've been in it for a while, a phase of rethinking. And that gets, or rethinking what internationalization should be. It no longer was simply, we want to establish it. It was the very question that Kalyani has been raising. What do we want to actually do with it? And we've been in that phase for a while. There've been all kinds of writings critiquing internationalization from within over the last decade. So this moment has come into that conversation. The conversation was already started, but it's thrown into relief some of the things that we should be thinking about if we haven't already, and that we need to continue thinking about. And it's revealed to me further with the second point. I said there were 2 points. So one is that this conversation was already underway. This is just intensifying the conversation. But then the second point is, and I think this also resonates with what Kalyani was saying, that international dialogue, our knowledge production that comes from international dialogue. This dialogue and collaboration contains its own power to transform from within. And international partnerships have been transforming us in a stealth way for a long time now. We have and have been revealing to us how much we need others. We need them for our research programs. We need them for the global learning for our students. We need them even to develop the vaccines, like the vaccine that Pfizer, the American company, developed with BioNTech, the German company, that may be coming out soon. That is a global collaboration. This is the transformative power of dialogue and collaboration in of itself. And so this is just the next step, but it's an intensified and sped up next step in what we're going to do with this power that we have unleashed through partnership.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. I would like you to react as well, Orla, if you can. And participants, please do not forget to send in your questions in the chat box.
Okay, gosh, there's so many different aspects and content there I could comment on, but let me go back to your original point about, is this situation, are things here to stay, or is this temporary? And I think that one of the things I would suggest is I do think a lot of how we're working now, it's more cost effective, it's more fluent, it's more frequent. I do think it's here to stay. I don't think we will go back to things that were more formal when we did them face to face and more costly, etc. I think there'll definitely be elements of how we're working now will stay with us. But one of the determinants of that, I think, also is our context. And I think what's really, how this pandemic is affecting everybody is very different according to context. I mean, I think some of the methodology of addressing it, we're all getting common access. But for example, I'm living in a rural, challenged country with great inequality. We are in a challenged environment in universities financially. We've had funding challenges. We're under-resourced versus what we're expected to deliver. The agendas keep getting added onto what we're supposed to do at a university, but the funding that comes with that is not commensurate, even in terms of staffing and access and so on. And for example, if we look at the decolonization debates, I mean, I wonder sometimes if, we aren't really looking at the impact of globalization as well, that it's not simply decolonization, it's actually the world as we understand it, sense making of the world, language we use to describe the world we currently live in versus the world, we all maybe were growing up in. The information exposure, the need to teach people how do you discern what's truth in the current world, what's not truth. I mean, there's some massive ethical questions about how do you prepare students to discern what is, how do they discern who to listen to? How do they discern to process information and so on? So I think some of the challenges we all have in internationalization is, to counterbalance some of the negative impacts of globalization, to shed light maybe on some of the hangovers of colonization that may remain in certain places. How do we make kind of education transformative with a big capital T? I think some of the issues that Kalyani raised about how this period has affected how we think about working and how we think about our lives and our priorities. I mean, it's been just the number of people who said they've spent more time with families and they've still managed to do their work. Obviously certain types of work. I mean, there's always also been a huge number of people that have completely lost their, employment during this period. But I think all of that and sense making of all of that is one of the big challenges for higher education. And I think that by having comparative perspectives, you can only kind of help make sense of the globe as it currently stands, rather than if you're trying to do it in isolation. Okay, I'm not sure if that has answered any of your questions, but certainly my previous speakers have triggered a lot of thinking. I'm like, maybe not as focused. I came straight on from another webinar that I was speaking at, and it's getting towards the end of my day here. So I hope that was coherent.
It certainly is. It certainly is. There is a question that would go a little bit further in the discussion as well, and it's a question to you, Susan, but it may then also offer the opportunity to Kalyani and Orla to reflect on it, because Nazir Ibrahim is asking if you could elaborate a little bit further about the difference between generative and transactional cooperation. Because this touches on something that you said earlier as well, that there is obviously this difference between the opportunity to transform within and all the other aspects. So please, the question is to you, and let's see if Kalyani and Orla can then pick up from there.
Sure. I'm making a distinction there between partnerships in which things are exchanged, such as students. A student exchange partnership is generally viewed as a transactional one, although they can become generative if you frame the student experience in certain ways. But if it's simply, we'll send you 2 students and you send us 2 students, that's a transaction, like a transaction in the marketplace. I'll give you $2 and you give me a loaf of bread, something like that. It's a transaction. It's a trading of resources. It's a trading in a way. It will affect the student exchange, will affect the students, but it won't necessarily affect the institutions they come from in any lasting way. And it doesn't build a very strong relationship between the institutions. And indeed, the US partnerships that didn't fare well when all the lockdowns occurred, et cetera, were those that were transactional without much attention having been paid to relationship building. Now, generative, and I used to call them transformational, but I've moved to generative as a better term. Generative partnerships are those in which you may be exchanging some resources, but you're also combining your resources to do something you couldn't do together. You couldn't do alone is what I meant to say. I said the reverse of what I meant. You're combining resources so you can do something you couldn't do alone. So if we take the student aspect of student-based partnerships, in that case, you might have students going back and forth, but you might be putting them into a cohort that meets virtually, a cohort of students from each institution that meets virtually throughout their student time at the university, at the universities, where you might have them working on collaborative term projects together, even when they're not face-to-face. You might have faculty co-teaching courses to this cohort of students. I could go on and on. You're combining your resources to create this real a microcosm of global interaction that will generate new ways of thinking for everybody involved. And that's just an example from the student side of it. We could go into the research side of partnerships or the community engagement, the sustainable development project kinds of activities as well. So generative, you're creating something new by combining resources.
Thank you. Yeah, no, definitely very interesting. I've always wondered, and with the IAU and my colleague who's in the session and facilitating all this, Giorgio Marinoni, the manager internationalization, we've always been very much involved in conversation on rethinking internationalization to that end as well. Also with ACE, also with the organization that Orla is steering, also with the members of the global higher education community. I think what you put at the center here is the why internationalize, to what end, rather than the why being connected only or more specifically to financial dimensions, you also look at the why in terms of what outcomes, how, and to what end in the end. There's a lot of work that has been done with ACE on internationalization at home, for instance, that you don't mention with so many words, but that are interesting in this context, as well as the internationalization at home, using all the enormous wealth of diversity and the knowledge systems that are within an institution can be tapped into much better. And that is something that may be also an opportunity today and less so in the past. But I will give the floor back to Orla here to react maybe on those dimensions as well. How does this resonate with the kind of work that's being done, for instance, at Rhodes University as an institution?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, a lot of our partnerships focus around specific academic endeavor. We also have large European consortia program about digital storytelling and letting communities express themselves. I'm hearing a very big echo. Are you? Can you hear me clearly? It's okay.
No, we can.
Okay. So, look, I think we need to rethink. I mean, in our university, the majority of our international students are full-time students from the rest of Africa, and particularly from the SADC region. Our kind of exchange programs for students are very small. We're kind of reactive to them in that people approach saying, can we send people to the university? It's not, we've actually been very much focused on our full-time African students, and, you know, there's a lot of issues in getting them kind of, you know, well looked after in the South African context and helping them with visas and immigration and all of those issues. The partnerships are very much academic partnerships, the bigger ones. And I think that is literally about the knowledge, the creation of the knowledge and the dissemination of the knowledge, and having mutual partnerships in knowledge creation. I mean, that would be kind of the big drive, really. And it's where it kind of meets the academic purpose and the academic endeavor. So it's quite different across the university. There is not necessarily one coherent approach to partnerships. But I think that we're interested in co-creation of knowledge. That is generally what we're interested in. You know, then the funding is, who can fund this particular endeavor is kind of how, the sequence of how it happens. So there'll often be a funding opportunity for a particular type of, you know, project, and it's quite hard to get people to kind of say, okay, we want to go and do a new project on the basis of funding. It's really about people kind of decide what they want to work on, where they want to go, and then it's like, can we find people that will help support this? So, you know, there's different nuances in terms of how you institute partnerships and then how you manage them, but I would say that they pretty much are falling in that generative category. They are not kind of some of them may end up being transactional if certain people leave. And, you know, I always find that sometimes the two people who initiate a program or a project are so passionate and enthusiastic, and if either one of them leave and the project stays behind, it can sometimes have a dip. But overall, I think that, yeah, the desired type of partnerships are the generative partnerships, where there's mutuality of give and take, there's mutuality of respect, and an appreciation of diversity of knowledge. So yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. Kalyani, I give you the floor.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't have said it better than Susan and Orla already did. I'll just take one aspect of what they said and maybe put it more explicitly. So much of the energy and resources in internationalization were dedicated to student recruitment in one part of the world and student mobility from a student recruitment, in the end, student recruitment standpoint in another part of the world, right? So much of the effort is dedicated at the student level engagement. So I would hope that the one shift that this might trigger is if we can have more faculty members really engaged in the international partnerships and making use of them in their teaching and research. And if through that faculty members can inspire students to look at things in a different way, because look, if a professor does not include literature from other parts of the world in their reading list, if they only mention certain names of certain institutions in their interactions with students, if they are not aware of what else is going on out there, it's unlikely that students are going to be enthusiastic about what is outside of the commonly known kind of names and places, right? So if there's one thing that could be really promising, one change or one development that could be that could really make a serious breakthrough, is I think if we could encourage more faculty members to be more active in the international partnership work.
Thank you. It's interesting. Just last week, I was invited to speak at a ministerial roundtable in a country in Europe where the minister had invited the Minister of Higher Education had invited his whole team to work with the universities and other higher education institutions to help think about a way to re-strategize internationalization at the level of the institution, but more in a whole of institution approach, kind of approach to internationalization. And also for the institutions to work collectively across the country and in a different mode around Europe, but way beyond. And the round table and the debate that took place was really about how to make sure that this pandemic is not going to bring universities to not contribute any longer to developing these outward-looking perspectives that go through the dynamics that Kalyani, Orla, and Susan, you have just explained. But really look at this whole of institution approach to things by involving everyone on board and getting the internationalization dynamics out of an international office. Bring it back to all staff, all students, bring it back even to the admin side of the institution, so that the international experience would be shared by all, and thus unleashing that potential at all the different levels and make everybody understand what to the minister was the basis of quality higher education, a better understanding of the world, and getting back to that philosophy of what a university stands on since its creation way back. So it was interesting because it talks to the different dynamics that you're also alluding to. So rethinking internationalization and then leading through internationalization dynamics to revisited and probably better international partnerships, more equal ones, more meaningful ones, more generative ones to some extent. So the Nazia Ibrahim asks another question about how depoliticizing higher education partnerships, where there is a lot of suffering from the unwillingness of possible international partners from cooperating because of the current situation in the country. And so probably the question is also about how to bring higher education back above these political considerations and go into something much broader. And the second question by Michel Rémy Njiki, the permanent changes that the context bring about and the impact it will have on higher education. What kind of prediction exercise are taking place? Where is the current context taking us to? Less in-person mobility or what else? And so what kind of a future? So yes, the future of international cooperation and academic exchange. And there I will start with you, Kalyani, then Orla, and back to Susan. And 2 minutes each, please, if you can.
Those are some great questions. You know, the depoliticization aspect of it is a tough one. Indeed, you know, the history of the internationalization project suggests that at various points it was really designed to meet broader geopolitical, geostrategic and political objectives, and that continues to be true to this day. I think what we can do a better job of at our level is really think seriously about and better explain how the internationalization project really is about intercultural dialogue and understanding. And I would say it is a little bit our fault that we have allowed ourselves to be so absorbed by the program details and by doing a lot to justify our existence and to very kind of data-oriented deliverables, which is the reality today, that we have lost sight of the original intended purpose of internationalization, which was intercultural dialogue, learning, and understanding. So I think as long as we can refocus on that and do a better job of communicating how we're achieving that, then I think we would be able to rise above the politics.
Orla?
Okay, thank you for both these really interesting questions. I'm thinking I might start with this one about where is the current context taking us to, because it might then help with answering the question from our colleague in Syria. Look, one of the things I think, and we're seeing it and feeling it in our context, in our situation, is a lot of our income generation activities have been affected by mobility. So we have a residential system, and several other universities do. Those are beds that are lying empty. So that is a core kind of supplementary funding to what we would be expecting coming in. And that is having an impact and a knock-on effect on all of our budgets. So I think one of our immediate kind of impacts of this in the future is going to be tighter budgets. And we were concerned that perhaps international office budgets may be affected disproportionately. I mean, we know some of our government institutions, they're starting to lay off staff. And so, that's kind of an indicator. I think we're going to have some tight times ahead. And I think a lot of the income streams that we've all used to sustain the universities are being impacted. I was on a Times Higher Education leadership call just last week. And one of the universities was saying that, they actually have a guest house or, private accommodation, and that is one of their income streams. COVID hit that. They have reserves in a bank. The interest rates have all fallen this year. Their income has been hit there. They rely on international students paying a little bit more. Mobility stopped their international students coming in. So I think we're going to see cuts from our core funding, and we're going to see all the things we do to supplement income getting a bit of impact. They're just not going to be able to be done in the same way. So while we figure that out, I think money is going to be extremely tight, and everybody is going to be extremely cautious about what they invest in and where they put their money. And that brings me to my colleague in Syria, which is, probably one of the realities that, people, when they're using funding and they are using taxpayer funding, they're going to want to put it in situations where there is some kind of, consistency or longer term situation. And I think in situations of conflict, there are just lots of entities see it as a high risk entity in investment. And I mean, that's not to say that I agree with that as a value system or a prioritization, but I do think it's just one of the realities of how, when you've got limited funding, people are going to invest it in something that they feel is going to be, a secure and sure thing. But I do think that even, kind of this type of online engagement, there's lots more scope for partnerships that can kind of, show solidarity. There is lots more room for engagement. There's lots more room for building understanding of what's going on in different parts of the world. And I think that, we all could, if we go to this kind of conscious, intentional, peace building, going back to the origins of internationalization before it got so commercialized by so many entities. I mean, for many people, I think they've confused the purpose of internationalization to how do we use international students to supplement our kind of budgets, and they've lost the whole plot in what it was all about in the first place. But I think maybe this is an opportunity to get back to doing that kind of interaction, that kind of partnership. So again, it's not mobility, but it's solidarity, it's engagement, it's building understanding. So yeah, that's my tuppence worth. Let me just let somebody else come in at that point.
Susan, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'll try to build on very good points that both Orla and Kalyani have made. I'm not sure we can ever be free of politics, because it's been clear that international cooperation has been made a political item. At least in the United States it has. And so what we have to do is a lot of communication, as my colleagues have been saying here, a lot of communication within our institutions, but I also think within our nations about the value of international cooperation on various levels. And we've been talking about it, making explicit its values within our universities. I think we have to make explicit its values for our communities, including communities where there's some fear of the other or suspicion, or where it has been politicized. We have to pull it back in some way. And here's where a lot of US institutions are now, in the internationalization at home, are working with their surrounding communities, working with various civic organizations, working with businesses that are multinational in scope, working with the very significant immigrant communities that are all over the United States. Some of you will have noticed the piece of Kenyan cloth hanging behind me there. But when there was, I was in Indiana, at Indiana University at the time, in 2008, when there was post-election violence in Kenya that was, crazy things happen in other parts of the world. But we were able, with our Kenyan partner, Moi University, to put on a large program for the community of Indianapolis, the capital city of the state of Indiana, about what were the roots of this violence and why did it break out and how would it tamp down. And it was attended by thousands of people in Indianapolis. They wanted to know. And this then made this a more understandable. Yeah, okay, I see how this happened. Now we'll work with Moi University to see what we can do to improve the situation for the people in Western Kenya that led to blah, 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 which ultimately led to reopening the textile factory that produced that piece of cloth on the back of hanging behind me. But I also want to say that I led Indiana University. We were the first university allowed by the US government to have a partnership with an Iranian university. And this was also back about 12, 15 years ago. We got permission from the Department of State and the Department of Treasury to do this with the University of Tehran. An incredible experience that, once again, we made sure, we went to all of our members of Congress, before we did it, we made sure that we had laid the groundwork that this was going to be an incredible cultural exchange. And it was. And we even got the most conservative Republican member of Congress to say, oh yeah, he wanted to meet the Iranian students when they came. Unbelievable. And right now, I will say in my retirement, but I'm working with the Institute of International Education with the Palestinian universities in the West Bank, and getting them into partnerships with US institutions. And again, we have to do a lot of laying the groundwork first, but now the Palestinian Affairs Unit of the US Embassy in Israel, don't get me started, but anyway, we're working with the Palestinian Affairs Unit And they have come up with funds to seed fund 5 partnerships between U.S. and Palestinian universities. And I'll just conclude by saying when I traveled to the West Bank a year ago, less than a year ago, before all of this happened, and then we've been in touch ever since. Once COVID happened here, they said, well, welcome to our world. We know what it's like to be shut down. And they had lots of skills that they were able to teach us about what you do in that situation. So I think there are ways, and it's actually imperative that we reach out and reach these parts of the world. I've lost the name of the questioner because the chat box has moved. But in any event, and that there's so much to be gained, but we have to lay the groundwork that this is going to be received as what it is, as an exercise in building understanding and collaboration in the face of daunting circumstances and independent of some of the overarching ideological political considerations. So this gets to the point I made earlier, that our partnerships operate on a very different plane from many other international relationships, and we should be proud of that.
Yes, wonderful. Well, this gives me a very nice segue into a little bit of history. For those who don't know, but the basis upon which the International Association of University was built 70 years ago. We start celebrating 70 years of international cooperation on 9 December, when the actual constitution of the IAU was signed at UNESCO. It was built to generate the kind of dynamics that you all three have so very nicely depicted, this need to build new kinds of understanding around the world. So the very start of the association was really to bring people together, to make sure that those who do not want to sit at the same table do come sit at the same table. And this could happen through higher education, because higher education, yes, to a certain point, it is politicized, and maybe today more again than in the past, because we see that there is this interpretation also of the political dimension of anything that is being done in a university. But the higher education staff and students and anybody within an organization or an entity like a university has this incredibly beautiful opportunity to bring the people together in a different way. And so that is how the IAU was called into life. It was aiming to bring the communities from around the world together. It started off between Europe and the US, Europe and Africa, and it moved into Latin America, into Asia, in all the different regions of the world. It started off by traveling by boat, by train, by plane, by letters. We have in the archives beautiful letters of improbable connection between communities around the world. And it results in our annual conferences where we see people sit together. Sometimes they don't want to be photographed because they're not supposed to be speaking to each other according to political lines and walls that are imaginary, but that have so many impacts. But they speak to each other. And these networks of improbable networks and networking institutions is what our work of all here in this virtual room, but also the participants, we're all about, to break down the silos, to break down the walls of ignorance, to break down the walls of non-connection between knowledge systems even. Because we have a tendency at times, and that is something that Kalyani said strongly, to also always refer to the same researchers or to the same scientists. But there is so much more knowledge that can be shared on different footing. More universities we've worked with a lot. OP Jindal University I came to get to know by attending a conference in Bucharest, and we started a conversation, and that's how Kalyani today is sitting in our conversation. So these opportunities come through international opportunities that were physical, today are more online, and we hope that together we can continue to contribute to those dynamics and continue to deconstruct walls that should not be there, because the world will not be in a better place if we continue to worship these walls that should not exist. So it's to generate, and that's the generative part, to generate better understanding around the world, to connect the knowledge systems, to generate a different move to a better open world, where everyone has a seat at the table and should be proud to sit at the same table, from Syria to Palestine to Israel to the US to France to Germany to Sweden to South Africa to wherever, to India, to Spain. There are many participants from Spain today also in the conversation. We had Iraq, Iran. So it's interesting to see where this opens up this kind of new, I hope that it will be a continuous dialogue into the future. And then we have one slide we wanted to share, because we see also that the future will allow to bring back into the universities different kind of people as well. The student will change form, we believe, and will change age as well. We will go to more lifelong learning opportunities, and to better understand the role that universities play in also that dimension, and opening up to new opportunities in terms of, well, bringing back to this opportunity to open up to new ideas. Lifelong learning has a lot of potential, and universities are a key operator in there. And with the UNESCO Institute of Lifelong Learning, we have launched a global survey on the dynamics around lifelong learning. And I don't know if, Giorgio, you managed to bring that slide up. It's just one slide to just bring that to your attention, because it is actually linked also to these dynamics. By fostering lifelong learning at our institutions around the world, we will connect generations, we will connect different people who maybe never had the opportunity to go to university, and finally will have that opportunity to bring people from different parts of the world together in one and the same classroom. And we hope that many of you in this virtual conference space today will see this as an opportunity to inform future policies around lifelong learning. I don't see Giorgio being able to pull that up, but we will share it when we will write to everyone, and we will share the link with you, because that's another dimension as well. Universities are opening up. You said, Susan, that they're opening up to communities differently. Orla, you said the same as well. Kalyani, this opening up. And we see that with our organizations sitting at the table, represented at the table, were it IIE or ACE or YASA or ANIE or others, we also see the importance of the local mission of universities, and yet not to only close the perspectives and say we have to only work locally. No, but in those local communities, there's so much potential for opening up to the world as well. And through local missions, also connect the local to the global. So these dynamics, I just want to bring in a few other topics that actually, to my understanding of the beautiful contributions you've made, are also connected to those other dimensions. So we're running over time, but can I just give one word back to you, maybe a few seconds? Susan, you're on the screen. Maybe you want to say a last word before we close, or last same, and then Kalyani, and then we will stop here. The recordings will be made available to all, so please wait for us to get back to you. We will share the link so that you can share that in your networks, and you can see again what you may have missed. I see in the chat that some had a hard time getting connected, and that's unfortunate, but a reality. So, Susan.
Well, I think that this webinar is a microcosm of what we want to have happen. I have never interacted with Orla or Kalyani before, but we are saying much the same sorts of things, and we've come to this from different points of view, but we've ended up at the same place, which is, I think, something really telling here, what the value of global dialogue can be, and how we all want to get to this place where we are able to have these conversations. So thank you to IAU for putting this together. I'm really happy to have been a part of it. Thank you.
Together with you, the Orla.
Okay, I'm just gonna say something a little emotional and just say that, you know, it's wonderful, even if we're physically distant and physically, you know, not able to engage, that engagements like this, they help you internally and they help us as beings to become more whole. And I would just like to say to everyone to stay open, to stay hopeful, stay safe, and in the lonely moments, you're not alone.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I think Kalyani needs to be let in to speak, so maybe someone can knock me out.
I don't know if Giorgio hears me and if he can bring Kalyani back in.
Yeah, she needs to be brought in.
He has some connectivity problems.
Our room is resource restricted. Only so many people can be up at the same time.
Well, let's see. So if not, I would like to thank everyone, and I hope that that Giorgio manages to help us out and bring Kalyani back in. And otherwise, I would like to a warm round of applause to all three of you for your excellent contributions, which are actually a start of a much broader conversation that we will have. And we will certainly bring you back in other conversations in the future as well. Thank you to all those in the chat who reacted and who shared their ideas, questions, and suggestions. We will look at those again after the webinar to see if we missed on any of the questions, because that's usually how it works. People start asking questions towards the end and then we have less time. But we will get back to those and we will also redirect them to the speakers. So thank you very much for your involvement. We very much appreciated this diversity of thoughts and also that divergence and connectivity at the same time. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening, night, morning, depending on where you are around the world. And we look forward to continue this conversation in many different settings in the future. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Susan. Have a good day.
Sorry, I'm leaving.
Yeah, I'm leaving too.